All right. As much as I detest the sound of my own voice being played on a recording, I do this for you. And I've had a cookie, so I feel better. All right. Union in crisis. Here we go. So we're starting in 1850. And the reason for that is because of the Compromise of 1850, which was a series of acts that was proposed by Henry Clay, who's a senator from Kentucky. And he's, I guess you could kind of call him a moderate, at least for the time period. The four pieces of the Compromise of 1850 are California admitted as a free state, a new Fugitive Slave Act, which is a piece of crap piece of legislation that required all citizens to catch and return runaway slaves, even if they made it to a free state. You've got New Mexico and Utah deciding on slavery by vote, and then some stuff about slavery in Washington, D.C. But these are the two most important provisions right here. And, one pleases the North and the other pleases the South. So it's, again, trying to continue that balance between North and South as we approach the Civil War. Calhoun, John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster are two main senators that are very powerful and very influential during this time period, and they're going to go after each other in the Senate. Calhoun represents South Carolina. Webster represents Massachusetts. So you can kind of obviously see where they fall on this issue. Calhoun threatens secession, which is nothing new, and then Webster is saying that you need compromise. So they battle it out, and ultimately the compromise passes Congress and the Senate, and President Fillmore, who's irrelevant except for this one action, signs it into law. Post-compromise, you have anger over the Fugitive Slave Act, and so you have an increase in moral outrage over slavery, and then you end up with more abolitionist activity in the North. So you have increased abolitionism via the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman, etc. And so the increased abolitionism is a direct result of the Fugitive Slave Act. Another direct result of the Fugitive Slave Act is this, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a novel, a fictional novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which helped to draw attention to why slavery was so bad and what the actual conditions were of slaves working in the South. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin is extraordinarily important. It is a direct result of the Fugitive Slave Act, and helped reveal horrors of slavery to people who weren't familiar with it. Next big piece of this sectional crisis puzzle is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. Nebraska Territory had been one big piece, and it gets split into two parts. And the key part here is that the residents would be allowed to vote on slavery. And the reason that that's a big deal is because it nullified the Missouri Compromise. So the Missouri Compromise established that slave-free state border in 1820 as the southern border of Missouri, meaning anything south of that would be admitted as a slave state and anything north of that would be admitted as a free state. And this Kansas-Nebraska Act completely ignores it. And so it gives residents the ability to vote on slavery. And so both people from the North and the South go to Kansas to influence the vote. And you ultimately end up with Bleeding Kansas. Anytime you get Northerners and Southerners in the same space and motivated by the issue of slavery, you always end up with violence. It's an extraordinary event. It's just riots upon riots upon riots, and trying to get Kansas to go one way or another. These people were never intended on staying there. They moved there to influence the vote, and then they were planning on leaving. So it's a little twisted, but that's what you end up with as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The next big piece is Dred Scott versus Sanford. So this is a SCOTUS case. So this is Supreme Court of the United States. This is a case between Dred Scott, who was a slave, who sued for his freedom. And his rationale for suing for his freedom is that he and his owner had moved from Missouri, which was a slave state, to Illinois, which is a free state. So Scott's decision is that I live in a free state now. I am a free man. And he's not wrong. But the problem that he runs into ultimately is this guy, Roger B. Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He rules against him by saying that slaves were property. And because they're property, they're not allowed to sue in court. You wouldn't let a horse or a cow sue in court and their property. So therefore you can't let a slave. And he also nullifies the Missouri Compromise, And so he's very popular in the South, but the North is profoundly PO'd by what Roger Taney does in his decision on Dred Scott. But this is a really important case in terms of the progression of events from 1850 to the Civil War. By the end of the 1850s, you have a monumental failure of all attempts at compromise. There is nothing to be gained anymore by taking a middle-of-the-road stance. That's kind of over. And the key point here is that people become more radicalized and extreme. There is no middle ground. There is no more compromise. There is no more, let's try to work this out. It is very much, I am on one side, you are on the other, and we need to stick to the most extreme, elements of our views. Which brings us to a rise in radical abolitionism, as exemplified by this guy here, John Brown. John Brown was a huge proponent of violence, and he's in Bleeding, Kansas. He and his brothers, I think, attacked a whole bunch of people and hacked them to death with broadswords. Good times. And then he leads a small army of men to attack a federal arsenal, meaning like a weapons depot, at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. And his goal was to inspire slaves to join a revolution and defeat slavery. And, that sounds good to us, but you have to realize that in terms of Southerners, an armed slave revolt is their biggest fear. Slaves with guns is the worst thing that could possibly happen. He fails, and then he actually ends up getting tried and then hung, executed for his role in that. John Brown does. And so now here we are in 1860. Tension is at an all-time high, and the question then becomes, can a nation that is this divided come to a consensus in an election year? Can they vote someone as one into office? And the fact that there are four people running for president in 1860 should give you some indication as the answer to that question, which is no. You have a Democratic Party that is split into two factions. John C. Breckinridge, who's the Southern Democrat, gotta protect slavery. Stephen Douglas, who's the Northern Democrat, he's from Illinois, and he is a former Senate opponent of Lincoln's. Stephen Douglas, he believes that slavery should be decided by popular sovereignty, basically by a vote of the people who live there. That's what he thinks. You've got our guy here, Lincoln, who's a Republican, but he runs on what's called a free soil platform. So he runs on a platform of slavery not being allowed in the territories. He doesn't run on an anti-slavery platform. He doesn't run on an abolitionist platform. It's a common misconception. He believes that that slavery should not be allowed to expand. That's Lincoln's view, full stop, at least in 1860. And then you've got John Bell, who is what they call a constitutional unionist. This is kind of a one-and-done party. They only have the one election, and then that's kind of it. And Bell is of the mind that the federal government should support both slavery and defend the Union. So he's trying to have the best of both worlds, but that's not going to work out for him. So obviously we get our guy, we get Lincoln, but that's the last straw. That is the last straw for the South. The South is done, especially South Carolina. That's just kind of it. They're done. They believe that they have no voice in government anymore, and so they're just done. So less than a month after the election takes place, South Carolina secedes from the Union. They're the first, and then everybody else follows them. You get the states with the largest enslaved populations will follow them. So by the time you get to January, February of 1861, all of these states are gone. So South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas are all gone by the beginning of 1861. And so, Lincoln, who isn't even inaugurated yet, he won't get inaugurated until March of 1861. He's powerless to stop any of it. And Buchanan, who is the current president, is just sitting on his hands.